morning, everyone, and welcome back. Another day of interviews with all of the candidates who are running for governor of the state of Maryland. And today I am honored to be here with Doug Gansler, former Attorney General, Democratic candidate for governor. And Doug, we are here on behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association, partnering up with Stevenson University on this incredible Stevenson campus. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. It's an honor to be here with you, and welcome.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank you for all your service. And you and I worked together for many, many years in Annapolis in your role as Senate Judicial Proceedings, and we tried to get some really good laws passed to help victims and the folks in Maryland. So thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, and it's great to have you here. We've got an hour to talk through as many issues as we can get to, and so let's just get started. For those who don't know you, and obviously you've been around politics for a long time, but for those who may not know you, can you just talk personally about yourself? Like, who is Doug Gansler, and how is it that you came to be sitting here running for governor of the state of Maryland?
Well, thanks, Bobby. Yeah, and so I actually am the only practicing member of the bar that's running for governor. I'm the only lawyer that's been practicing. I've been practicing for 32 years. I also am the only person running for governor of Maryland who grew up in Maryland, and so on the Democratic side. So I grew up here, proud graduate of the Chevy Chase Elementary School, went to Yale University, UVA Law School, and then came right back to Maryland, clerked for John McAuliffe on the Maryland Court of Appeals. Worked for a law firm for a couple years, then went into government, because that's public services in my currency, which drives me. And I became an assistant United States attorney for 6 years, mostly doing homicides, but all types of crimes. At the U.S. Attorney's Office, Eric Holder was my boss. I then ran for state's attorney against the machine, 30 years of incumbency, and was able to win that race on a platform of community prosecution, where you prosecute by neighborhoods instead of sort of arbitrarily by crime. We, in Montgomery County, which has about 1.1 million people, we counted our murders in the teens each year. And so community prosecution was a really great program, and hopefully it'll be adopted more widespread around the country. And if I'm governor, certainly will be in Maryland. After that, I ran for Attorney General, served for 2 terms as Attorney General, 2 terms as State's Attorney. While I was Attorney General, I was president of all the Attorneys General of the United States, the National Association of Attorneys General. I was also president of the Democratic Association of Attorneys General, and did that for 8 years, and we had a number of accomplishments there. Ran an office mostly because the people we hired were the best and the brightest, and they did really serve the folks in Maryland well. Since then, I've been out of office, ran for governor in 2014 against the establishment, lost that race, and hence we had a Republican governor for the last 8 years. Since that time, I've been in private practice. I work for Cadwalader, Wickersham & Taft. It's the oldest law firm in America, started in 1792. I run their state attorney general practice, but I also have done a number of other things. For example, I represent some states in lawsuits against the fossil fuel companies around climate change. I'm on the board of College Track. I'm on the board of Year Up. I'm on the board of the lacrosse program that I started in Baltimore City called Charm City Lacrosse about 12 years ago. And I was sort of, like all of us during COVID, was doing a lot of reflection and thinking about what I wanted to do. I was getting an enormous amount of pressure to run for governor from, ironically, the establishment, because they were not enamored with one of my competitors, and they thought that I was the only person that could win both the general and the primary. And so we would stop the string of having Republican governors in Maryland. Thought about it, talked to a lot of people about it, recognized that while I love my job, what really motivates me is helping people, particularly actually Baltimore City, which was one of the impetus, and we'll talk about that a little bit during the conversation, I imagine. And so I decided to do it. And it's a fascinating race, a really interesting race, and we're looking good. As somebody, one politician said to me the other day, "You're not the prohibitive favorite, but I'd much rather be you than anyone else in the race," and I think that's sort of where we sit.
Okay. Well, so we are going to get into a lot of those issues. I know you mentioned the environment, which is a big priority of yours. We're going to get there. Let me just ask a general question before we get into specificity. Talk about, in a Gansler administration, kind of what are your top priorities, you know, in the first year, in your first term? What are the things that drive you to want to run for governor, and kind of what is it that you want to bring to the state?
Yeah, so I think leadership is where it starts, and that's it, since we're being broad at the beginning, at least. You know, I'm the only person that's running that's led in a time of crisis, and we're in a crisis. We're in COVID. As we come out of COVID, we have to rebuild our economy. Right now it's a little bit of a Band-Aid because we've gotten so much money from the federal government. That's at some point it's going to be a day of reckoning, and we have to figure out how to rebuild the economy of Maryland. But doing so, making sure we tap in to the potential of every Marylander, regardless of what they look like, where they're from, what their socioeconomic status is, and really providing access to opportunity for every Marylander, whether not giving them things, but access. And when you have access to that opportunity, whether it's housing, whether it's public health, education, jobs, criminal justice, that to me is going to be sort of the overriding concern of me being governor. But talking about leading in times of crisis, I led, when I was president of the National Association of Attorneys General, we had a similar economic crisis. We had the national mortgage foreclosure crisis. And I was president of the organization, all 50, the nonpartisan organization. We were able to get close to $38 billion of relief, fighting the big banks, bringing that money into the country, almost $2 billion of which came to Maryland to keep people in their homes away from being foreclosed upon and evicted. So I think that, sort of the economic message is there. You touched on the environment. I mean, that was my biggest issue when I was Attorney General. We did 22 river audits throughout the state. We took on big corporate polluters, but we also did positive programming as well to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. Well, we have climate change, and that's a real deal. I mean, people now recognize it's in sort of the mainstream conversation. I've obviously been talking about it for quite some time. And having federal partners like President Biden, whose son Beau was probably my best friend as we were attorney generals. We got elected together. He was from Delaware and I was from Maryland. He passed away, but I got to know the Biden people through that, and obviously Kamala Harris, our vice president, and I served together for 4 years when she was Attorney General of California. So I say that because having that partnership with the federal government and with state government is going to be important in climate change in terms of building our infrastructure for the electric vehicles that are going to be pervasive throughout the state, making sure we have solar energy on public land and incentives for the private sector, wind energy offshore at Ocean City. One of my pet peeves has always been to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure that goes into the Chesapeake Bay each year, our biggest organic source of pollution, into a power source so we can actually promote and build our agricultural industry on the Eastern Shore. So the environment is obviously going to be a big issue for us, and protecting the Chesapeake Bay, our treasure. Criminal justice is a massive issue. I was a prosecutor for 22 years. And while I recognize that we have to be far more imaginative and creative in the way in which we police in this country, we also have to recognize that crime disproportionately affects communities of color, underserved communities. Baltimore City is suffocating because we haven't had somebody that understands crime. I'm the only person in the race that's been involved in the criminal justice system that probably knows the difference between an indictment and a conviction, And so we have a lot of plans and programs to try and do that. A couple things that I did in my past that I want to bring to the future is I started the first domestic violence dockets in Maryland's history when I was at the state's attorney in Montgomery County, started the first drug courts. And those are kinds of things that we need to take to every courthouse, all 24 courthouses in Maryland, drug courts, domestic violence dockets. You obviously were a leader in those issues as well, and so I'm excited about that. And the last issue, and I have to talk about this because I think it's probably going to be the most important issue that we have. And I've led during a crisis there as well. I led during a crisis when people who were gay could not marry the person they loved. And I was 5 years ahead of every other politician in Maryland on that issue. Even our governor at the time was not for marriage equality, and went down to Annapolis. Probably remember some of the testimony was pretty interesting. But and that we're in another crisis, which is women's reproductive rights. And the Supreme Court, I argued in front of the Supreme Court. I won my case 9-0 in a child abuse case, Maryland versus Schatzer. And so I understand how they work. They don't take cases because they just want to hear the arguments again. They're either going to overturn Roe v. Wade or scale it back, which makes who is the next governor incredibly important, to make sure it's a Democrat, and a Democrat that understands how to manage the levers of government through a time of crisis and make sure we protect women's reproductive rights here in Maryland. And
other than, it's already in statute here, so what, to put it into the Constitution?
Well,
is that
maybe, but I'm not as much as a tinker with the Constitution as the next person, but we already have a statute. We need to protect it's all about enforcement, and while the regulations are there, we need to make sure we enforce it. We need to make sure we don't roll it back. Next year, I'm sure we'll touch on politics. Next year is going to be the biggest Republican year in our lifetime. You just saw a truck driver in New Jersey spent $150, put R next to his name, and beat the Speaker of the House. And most people in New Jersey didn't know there was a Republican running for governor. He almost won. He did win in Virginia. And 77 million Americans walked into a voting booth and voted for a mentally ill, narcissistic dictator wannabe president last year. And the Gansler poll here in Maryland just showed that it's going to be very difficult to beat a Republican, a moderate Republican here in Maryland. So it becomes critical that we elect a Democrat, and a Democrat that protects the statute, protects the rights of all women and to have the reproductive choice.
Okay, so a lot to unpack, and I'm excited to go through all these things. Let's start with criminal justice. And you were Attorney General and a state's attorney, I guess for 16 years total.
Yeah.
But now moving forward, what is with some, we've got a stubbornly high murder rate in the city of Baltimore, and murders kind of skyrocketing, not just here, but around the country. And the non-fatal shootings are up, well over 1,000 every year. So the 300 could easily be 500 if they were shooting straighter. So it's a crisis.
Yes. And
we've tried a lot of things in the state of Maryland. So what does a Gansler administration do about this this is a two-part question, in the short term and in the long term?
Yeah, I think it starts with making sure you have somebody as governor who understands the criminal justice system. And having been an assistant United States attorney for 6 years in sort of doing all types of crimes, white-collar prosecutions and kind of every type of crime there is. I've had over 200 jury trials, argued 54 appellate cases, and having managed from the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is, at the time, D.C. was just like Baltimore is now. The murder rate was sky high. It's going way, way down. And hopefully we'll talk about Baltimore a little bit, because Washington, D.C. is a city that's had its renaissance and is still growing in its promise. Baltimore City has not. And I think it's a lack of leadership at the state level, working with the stakeholders in Baltimore. And on the crime issue in particular, coming in, understanding the levers of government, how to work with the state's attorney's office, how to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, understanding the difference of what they are. This is how fundamental it matters. Right now, the last 8 years, we have a governor who, very popular governor, done a lot of good things, but he was a real estate developer, and then he became governor. So his background is not in sort of figuring out how to reduce crime. Mine is. And so there's a number of things we could do right away. One is sit down, roll up our sleeves, and figure out what's wrong and what's not working. I would put in community prosecution throughout Maryland, which is because the reason why that's so important is it's putting prosecutors working with the community police and building that trust between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And speaking of law enforcement, we're going to have a 2-year requirement for police officers, like we did in Montgomery County, where you don't hear a lot of problems with the police in Montgomery County. They hire the best and the brightest, they pay them well, and they're trained well. And we are part of that. Part of community prosecution is prosecutors going in and working with the police department to train police officers regarding cultural training, diversity training, that kind of thing. But giving a high school graduate a gun and a badge and saying, have at it, at 18 years old, doesn't yield great results for the community. And so getting an associate's degree at a community college or 2 years of education here at Stevenson would be, I think, a requirement and a good requirement.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
So there's a police shortage, and there's probably a lot of reasons for it. Everybody kind of points fingers at what they think is the reason. It doesn't really matter. There's a shortage of police officers here in Baltimore County. They're really having trouble finding new recruits. In Baltimore City, they're down, I think I heard hundreds of positions. That's all everywhere.
Hundreds.
So when you make it more challenging to become a police officer, will you do, is it your intention, if they need to go get a college degree, to have something like the nursing program, when we had a nursing shortage in the state, where essentially you go and work for a certain number of years and the state will pay back your tuition on that?
Yeah, or you can even go at night. You can do it concurrent. There's a lot of ways to get where we are, and I'd like to believe that right now the shortage is a result of COVID and also sort of the backlash against law enforcement. And Democrats are somewhat responsible for that a little bit with the whole defund the police. I'm running against a lot of defund the police crowd. And while, like I said, I was the head of the Criminal Justice Committee in Montgomery County in 1989 for the NAACP. So I've been in front of police reform for almost 30 years. And one of the things I did, for example, when I was state's attorney, was I put every police shooting in the grand jury. Anytime a police officer shot his or her gun, that went in the grand jury and let 23 people from the community make the decision as to whether that was a justified shooting or not. Police didn't like it at first, they embraced it at the end. They didn't like community prosecution at first, they embraced it at the end. Drug courts, keeping people out of jail and giving them a pathway back to productive citizens is yet another thing to do. In terms of a hiring of police officers, in Montgomery County right now, the training class has 13 people. 13 people for the most diverse county jurisdiction in Maryland. 1.1 million people speaking a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultural issues that arise, and we can't get police officers. Why? Because we're constantly bashing police, and I think Democrats are misreading that. I think we need to make sure that we protect. The number one job of government is to protect its citizens. And if we're not doing that, then we might as well not be talking about school, because you can't walk to school without getting robbed.
So how do we get them? I mean, how do we get police officers to want to stay in the profession? Because I hear from a lot of police officers that they're going to take early retirement.
For sure.
And you can't get recruiting classes. And some of the things, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what the General Assembly did in terms of the police reform last year, but kind of this whole national defund the police, and a lot of people on one side of the aisle kind of bashing police officers is causing people not to, I believe, causing people not to want to go into the profession. So how do we get them back in so that we don't have 13 people in a training class, that we get people that really want to be there, high-level folks that are excited to go back into public service as a police officer?
I think you have to change the conversation and recognize, I talk to people in Baltimore City, business folks, and they won't go to work because they're worried about getting knocked over the head at lunch for their cell phone. And so we need to change the conversation and make it a respected and respectable position. Look, should police officers be shooting people of color for no reason? Absolutely not. Do we need to ferret them out? Yes. Do we need to prosecute them? Yes. But most police officers are there. They're risking their lives. I personally prosecuted when I was in my days as state's attorney and attorney general. I used to do a lot of my own cases, and I prosecuted a guy named Terrence Green who shot Kyle Ollinger when he got pulled over at night in Silver Spring in the middle of the night. Rolled down his window. Kyle Ollinger walked up to the window, got rolled down. Terrence Green shot him. He's lying on the ground with his head on the curb, telling people to make sure that his child, his young son, was going to be taken care of. He was making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year defending us. And so I think we have to recognize and appreciate our police officers. But that said, they need to be well trained. They need to have diversity training, and they need to be respected from the governor on down.
And well paid.
And that was my second point. And you have to pay them commensurate with what they do. The problem right now is they get so much money in overtime because there's so few people that are coming in that the public gets outraged. But if you just paid them higher, like we should pay our teachers higher, these are like sort of frontline positions in our society, pay them higher and you're going to attract better. It's economics 101. You're going to pay people higher, you're going to get better people to the profession, and that's one of the things we need to do with the police. But we need to make sure that we don't go overboard on beating up on all the police officers, because there are some that are really not good.
Can I ask you about one specific provision of the police reform last year that continues to be controversial and may come up in the General Assembly this year? Had to do with the MPIA, the idea somebody gets accused of misconduct of some sort, it goes through the process, and it's found to be unfounded, right? So it's not a guilty, innocent thing, it's an administrative proceeding or administrative process, but it is unfounded. Advocates were able to get in there that all of that now is public information that they can get access to, and some organizations are actually just en masse trying to get all the accusations against police officers ostensibly for purposes of embarrassing them and calling them out and so forth, even when those things are found to be untrue or false allegations. Should a police, and I've heard from police officers that is a serious issue for them. They feel unsafe because of it. Should that have been a provision in the law, or should there at least be an opportunity for them to shield or expunge those types of records?
So I believe in innocence until proven guilty, and I believe it for the folks that the police are going after, and I believe it for the police themselves and everybody. And so I have a problem with the way in which that is in now, but I think it'll, what happens with a lot of these police reform bills is they're being passed by people that don't have a background in criminal justice and don't understand sort of the practical ramifications of what has been passed. I would say I think the General Assembly did a great job in the dialogue, debate, and conversation around these issues. Where they landed is not perfect on so many of the bills, and there's a lot of more that they can and should do going forward. They're like no-knock warrants, chokeholds, that kind of thing. I mean, it really doesn't, disproportionate to communities of color doesn't really help the issue as much as things like we should legalize cannabis and we should expunge records of people who have convictions based solely on cannabis possession. That's how we're going to pay for my programs of universal child care and universal pre-K. And so I think the idea of beating up on police officers in general and law enforcement in general because of few specific problems it may not be the solution. We need to have prophylactic measures to make sure that officers that are bad, and for lack of a better word, are removed from the department. That's what I did when I was state's attorney in Montgomery County. We would not sponsor or promote police officers that we thought were not telling the truth. One of the benefits of community prosecution is the prosecutors and the police are working together every day. So you as a prosecutor have a quick recognition of what police officers are doing a good job and which police officers their story is a little bit fishy constantly. And so then you kind of identify them and they're removed from the department. We were able to do that when I was state's attorney. That's the kind of reform we want to put in when I'm governor.
Okay. I want to stay on the issue of public safety, and specifically, fairly recently, the governor came out with some proposals, and I'll just go through a couple of them. One of them was judicial transparency, and the details of it, I haven't seen the legislation, and it's not being brought up during special session, but essentially data about judges and what they're doing for sentencing for certain violent crimes and for repeat violent offenders. A second bill, we'll go through these one by one. The second bill or second idea is one that's been around for a while and somehow has not been able to be passed. Very popular with the community, but somehow continues to be there, which is essentially enhanced sentencing for repeat convictions for use of an illegal gun in the commission of a violent crime. And then there's some stuff about Baltimore City State's Attorney, which we don't really need to get into. That's more of a local issue. But on those two particular issues, what are your thoughts about that? And then kind of beyond that, what else, if not that, then what else should we be doing kind of short term to try to stem the violence in Baltimore City and across the state?
Yeah. So I'm going to be like a little bit of a politician on the first question, okay, because I'm going to answer with a different question, which is completely related, and I'll tie it back, which is about judicial transparency. One of the things we need to do, and I've been pushing for years, and you recall I brought Sandra Day O'Connor down to Annapolis on this issue, is getting rid of judicial elections. And the reason why I think those two issues are inextricably tied to the transparency issue is because we need to have the best and the most meritorious people sitting on our bench. They shouldn't be the people who raise the most money from defense lawyers, knock on the most doors, and are deciding about somebody's liberty and sitting on a judicial bench. So, there's three reasons why we should get rid of judicial elections. One, taking money out of politics. The Supreme Court actually, in a case called Caperton in West Virginia, talked about that very issue, about how unseemly it is. Two, we want and this gets to the transparency issue, we want our judges to rule on each and every case that's in front of them based on the facts of the crime on the criminal side and the law that applies to those facts. We don't want them to sit there and think there's somebody in the second row that's jotting down what the sentence is without really fully fleshing out what the crime was in the person's record. And the third reason is diversity on our bench. Every person of color that has had a contested election in the history of Maryland, that lives in Western Maryland, the Eastern Shore, or Southern Maryland has lost a contested election. You were a phenomenal politician. You never put the picture of your opponent on your mailers. Well, when you're a white person running for judge against an African American or Latina or Asian American, all of a sudden, this is the judge and this is who wants to be the judge, and they win every time. You know, Diamond Hill State and Alexander Wright. I mean, the elections are littered with minorities that have lost contested elections. So the transparency issue is a little bit of a problem because it has people, you can sort of fashion that any way you want to come after judges. And so that's that issue. I don't love the issue. I don't like doing it. Do we need to hold our judges accountable? Yes, we should have retention elections like we do for Court of Appeals and Court of Special Appeals.
Would you change circuit court if you want to do? If you do away with the circuit court elections, do you reduce your retention election down to 10 years, or do you keep it at 15?
You know, I'd be amenable to either. I think the 15-year number is consistent with Court of Appeals and Court of Special Appeals. We already have that in, so it makes sense for a consistency standpoint. But you could also put them all down to 10 years.
Okay.
I just don't want them elected. I just think that it's ridiculous to have. I think one of your colleagues once said, well, we have to run for office, they should too. It's like, well, they chose not to be, and you know who I'm talking about.
I do.
And they didn't choose to be politicians, they chose to be anti-politicians, they chose to be judges. So, and the second issue is on crime in Baltimore. So you have the best and the brightest judges. You identify and remove violent offenders from the street. So in terms of guns, you know, if you have a convicted felon in possession of a firearm, on the federal side, you have 5-year mandatory minimum.
Right.
On the state side, you might get a PBJ. And so we need to recognize that the violent offenders need to be removed from the streets. People who have health addictions, drug addictions, they need to be helped. If you go on my website, douggansler.com, you'll see I just rolled out our mental health platform. And because so many people that are in jail and so many people that are homeless and have mental health issues, and we need to get them help. And by the way, part of that platform is making sure we have mental health professionals available for law enforcement, because the PTSD and some of the issues that we talked about that are hurting emotionally law enforcement officers, and then they're out on the streets, you want to make sure they have access to mental health. So getting violent offenders off the streets is number one. Community police and making sure you have the best and the brightest police officers, like we talked about, community prosecution, and ultimately community courts. So that, as you know, in Baltimore City, for example, with so many judges, a judge says, you know, if you ever come back here before again, I'm going to throw the book at you, and then they get a different judge. But if you have judges assigned to different communities, it just takes a bigger city and shrinks it into smaller communities where that judge has seen that same defendant over and over, and they're working with them to try and help them. So we're not locking up so many people, and that we're making sure that they're productive members of society. And the last thing I'll mention is something I've been talking about for years, which is returning citizens, reentry. So people coming out of jail should be able to get trained and get a certification when they're in jail, whether it's auto mechanics, whether it's culinary arts, and then give a tax break to businesses that will hire them and give them a chance. Give them a chance. No one wants to be in jail. Give them a chance to succeed. And so we need to make sure the government is supportive of those efforts.
Okay. And I was curious because during the Ehrlich administration, you had Project Exile, and it was brought to the state. And essentially we were pushing a lot of people up into the federal system for the 5-year mandatory minimum. I assume because you don't hear that much about that anymore, that's not going on. And so what of the idea of enhancement of sentences for the repeat violent crimes here, not just in Baltimore. I don't want to pick on Baltimore City because it really is everywhere. And so what of the governor's plan? I haven't heard, I brought it up with a bunch of candidates and everybody kind of sloughs it away. It seems like it's pretty popular and seems like it might help, but would like to hear your perspective for somebody who's been a state's attorney and attorney general and in the system for so long.
No, I'm not surprised they slough it away because this is why it's so important, I think, to have someone as governor. And obviously I have a lot of other issues that I'm running on, the environment and a number of other things. But criminal justice is important, and and keeping people safe is critical. And so I do know what Project Exile is, and I was actually state's attorney at the time, and worked, we did a lot of stuff with interaction with the federal government and the state government. I remember when Rod Rosenstein was the U.S. attorney here, we were able to work with him. He was the first U.S. attorney on the federal side. Now we have Eric Barron, who's going to be wonderful, and one of my former guys, Phil Selden, is the chief deputy. I think the U.S. Attorney's Office of Maryland is going to excel right now. But we were able to take RICO cases, gang cases, and put them in the RICO statute and give them to the federal government, and you don't hear as much about, do we still have a gang problem? Yes, but it's gone down because a lot of it is the enforcement mechanism. So when you're looking at the possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, which is what we're talking about when you're talking about Project Exile, there's a 5-year mandatory minimum in the federal government. Before you take those cases to the federal government, though, you can work with, as a part of the plea agreements, and 90-something% of cases plea out. If someone's willing to accept responsibility and they want help, we should provide that so that they're not out there shooting people. So you can take that case, and before you give it to the federal government, try and work it out and get a reasonable plea for that person. But when the word mandatory minimum comes up, everyone runs away, and it's a little bit like guns. It's not binary. In the gun context, which is what we're talking about, even the gun nuts, recognize you can't walk into a gun store, you shouldn't walk into a gun store and be able to buy a bazooka, a tank, a grenade. But on the other hand, you should also, there's a middle ground, and you also shouldn't have an AK-47 either. And the law doesn't provide for you to have an AK-47. So on the streets, if you are, in terms of mandatory minimum, if you are going to have a mandatory minimum, the one crime that you should have a mandatory minimum for is a convicted felon in possession of a firearm. Period. That said, on other crimes, most other crimes, maybe perhaps all other crimes, you don't want to take the discretion away from the judges for the reason I said before, which is every criminal is different and every crime is different. And the judges should have the discretion to mete out an appropriate sentence for that person, given what the act that they committed and the proof that the government has, and hold them to the burden to be able to prove that that person indeed committed that crime.
Okay. We've talked a lot about criminal justice. We've got about 30 minutes left, so halfway through, and we've done one topic, and I know you have a lot that you do want to get to. So I'm going to move on. You have addressed already judicial elections, which is something that is important to the bar, and wanted to hear your perspective. And first year, I know you've been coming down to Annapolis for many years trying to get rid of judicial elections. Let's move on to the environment. I know that's a big part of your platform and what you did as Attorney General. Can you talk about kind of some of your accomplishments as Attorney General related to the environment, things that you were trying to work on, and then, of course, most importantly, in the Gansler administration, what is your focus in the environment, and kind of what are your specific proposals on that? Yeah,
and focusing on it, I think is important. So, the day I decided to run for governor, the sort of the moment I decided was when I was in Baltimore, sitting in a car about to go to Terra Cafe, and was finishing a phone call and watched sort of people wandering around seemingly without hope, optimism, and a future. And in the city that's so vibrant and beautiful, with the port, with the #1 hospital in the world, with such brain power, the tech base. I mean, you can go on and on, as you know, about how wonderful Baltimore can be and should be, and we just need leadership. We just need somebody in the governor's office that can do this. Well, the moment that happened for me with Attorney General, when I was driving across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge with my 2 sons in the back of the car and saying, I'm going to run for this job. It's called Attorney General, you don't really know what it is, but I'm going to clean that up. I'm going to clean up that Chesapeake Bay, because that's the treasure of our state. That's the thing that people know about all over the world. And as Attorney General, I think, and then now as governor, we have to have somebody who recognizes the importance of the environment, both from an environmental perspective and from a climate change perspective. And I think they're inextricably tied, but both important. So as Attorney General, I mean, I did things like, we did the 22 river audits where we would go. It's like a little bit like crime. You go into a neighborhood and you ask somebody, well, who's the grandma that gives cookies to the people? Who's the thug that's on the corner that the kids are afraid of? And everybody knows who the good people are and the bad people. Same on a river audit. These are the people that are polluting. These are the people that are doing great things, living shorelines and that kind of thing. And so the first thing I did was I hired a special assistant for the environment. I then started environmental counsel with General Frosch, continued. of having the leader of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, all the different groups that are doing environmental work, having them meet once a month and having them meet with people from our office that are doing the regulatory and enforcement side and talk to each other about what are the priorities, what should be the priorities. I had a legislative priority each year. Got arsenic taken out of chicken feed, for example, worked with you on that issue. And each year I had one bill, and we passed 7 of the 8 years. The one we didn't pass was human discharge in the Bay, which was shocking, but eventually got passed. So I had to, and then I was aggressive. I mean, I went after. I know fracking is one of your big issues. I went after a company called Chesapeake Energy that blew up a fracking facility in Pennsylvania where the water, where the chemicals leached into our water in Maryland. I went after American Electric Power as the biggest air pollution case in American history. We had the biggest water pollution case prosecutions. So we were prosecuting corporate polluters. At the same time, we were working with local organizations, river keepers and such, to help them with their programming. And then at the Conowingo Dam, which every time there's a rain event, refrigerators and cots and things go over the dam and into people's yards. I mean, getting the Army Corps of Engineers to do the dredging there, working with other states is going to be important. So when I was Attorney General, I ran the environmental group for the country. When I'm governor, I want to do the same thing. I want to make Maryland the environmental center, the California, if you will, in terms of the environment only, on the East Coast. And we have that capacity, and we have the brain power to do that, including clean energy, getting carbon neutral as soon as we can. I'm a little cynical about politicians because I've been around them too much. They say, well, in some year where I'm not going to be in office, we're going to have a carbon neutral state. Well, I want to do it while I'm still in office. And so we really got to promote that and push that, get the electric cars. Electric vehicles is an interesting subject because it's the one area where the public sector is literally and figuratively driving. That's all they're going to make. But if I walk outside of Stevenson right now, or any place in Baltimore County or in the state, there's certainly no infrastructure ready for that to happen. Right. So as the governor, that has to happen. We have to work with other states. I remember I went after a company in Virginia called Omega that was taking all the menhaden, which is the most important fish in the sea that no one's heard of, which provides it's the food for the rockfish and so forth. And we need to work with our neighbors. I mean, the Bay itself, for example, and then I'll stop because you got me on the environment. The Susquehanna River starts in Cooperstown, New York. It's relatively pristine through New York. It hits Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, and other parts, and it becomes polluted. 50% of the Bay water comes from that river. Well, we need to work with Josh Shapiro, who's the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, and a friend, and he'll be governor of Pennsylvania, maybe Tish James in New York, and work with our neighboring states to try and collectively address this. I played team sports my whole life. I'm 59 years old. I still play lacrosse. I work as a team. I work with the General Assembly as a team. I work with the other governors as a team, and we need to work on the environment that way.
So let me ask you a specific question. I was, as you were talking about working with the other states, including Pennsylvania, Maryland, the only state in the country, and I know you had worked on this as well, the only state in the country, by doing it in a bipartisan way with the legislature and the executive working together, banned fracking, right? We're the only state to have done that. New York did it by executive order, and I think Vermont did it, but they don't actually have any natural gas, so it's more symbolic. But the problem is that we've been able to do it in Western Maryland, but just over the border in West Virginia and in Pennsylvania, they're fracking away. And so the benefits we get, the environmental benefits and the public health benefits we get from banning it on our side don't necessarily accrue because just over the border in 2 other states they're doing it. So how do you deal with that from an environmental perspective? We have decided to make a stand on it, but just they're not. And so what do you do? Yeah,
and obviously that was one of your big issues, and congratulations on that issue. I think you first have to know what fracking is. And again, I'm the only environmentalist running for governor on the Democratic side, well, probably on either side in this race. And it's interesting because we've talked about criminal justice and the environment, and it happens to be those 2 issues are sort of in the forefront of the American public, and those are 2 issues that I'm uniquely qualified in terms of this governor's race. And so understanding what fracking is, understanding the difference between horizontal fracking, vertical fracking, and where it can be done, and where the Marcellus Shale is or isn't. And I think you need to recognize that we need a lot of alternative sources of energy. And right now, in terms of fracking, you're working with West Virginia, working with Pennsylvania, working with other states, frankly, around the country, is going to be important to get the science to make it safe. Because fracking, in an aspirational sense, is not the worst thing in the world. In other words, if it gets to be, there comes a point where it's dispositively proven that it's safe for the environment, then it's a very cheap natural resource. But we're not anywhere near there, so we need to not have it until we're there. So helping to incentivize the science of it is one thing, but also working with our neighboring states. Now, the difficulty is going to be because it's such a Republican year, and I'm the only person in the Democrat, I think the Gansler poll shows this, and I think you can talk to me, I'm the only person that can win the general election that's in the Democratic primary. And so it's going to be very difficult in these other states to have Democratic governors, but because I work so well across the aisle, when I ran for president of the National Association of Attorneys General, I won 50-0. The Republicans voted for me, the Democrats voted for me. That's how I work. And so we can do the best we can on fracking and other issues, particularly environmental issues, with neighboring states, but I'm just hopeful that some like-minded thinking people get in those offices.
Okay. Anything you missed on environmental issues that you're trying to bring to the fore?
Well, if you look at our website, we have it's a very complicated, complex program. We have 32 different points on there that talk about some of the things we want to do. One of the, when I was Attorney General, we moved the critical areas back 50, where you could build in the critical areas from 50 feet to 100 feet. I actually have a moratorium on sprawl, because that's one of the biggest problems we have, like on the Eastern Shore. We've been fighting a development called Lakeside. It's over 2,000 homes in a little town called Trapp, which you've probably passed on the way to the beach. And we ought to have smart growth. We ought to have growth in the downtown areas. Senator Ron Young from Frederick endorsed me for my race because for a lot of reasons. One, he wants to win. That's what he says. He wants to have the actual. He's sick of losing these races. But two, because I'm supporting a conference center in downtown Frederick. Frederick's the biggest city in America that doesn't have a downtown hotel. And so where do you build the hotel? You build it downtown where you have parking and it's environmental safe, and that's where the other buildings are. And so we can't have sprawl. So part of our plan is to have a moratorium on sprawl in the critical areas. And I think that will help as well. So there's a lot of points on the platform, but it's all on the website.
Okay, let's move on. You mentioned cannabis before. That's obviously a big issue. Maryland has decriminalized small amounts of marijuana, has a now robust medical cannabis industry, and patients are able to access it to some extent, and that took a long time to get here. All of a sudden, states around the country are looking to legalize. You have endorsed the legalization of recreational marijuana. I guess my question is, what does that plan look like? Because it's probably going to land on the next governor's lap. If the tea leaves are right and all they're doing is a referendum this year, the next governor is going to have to deal with this issue. What does your plan look like? And kind of as a corollary to that, how do you, one of the issues that at least has come up in other states is that the medical industry has been hurt, and so you have this strange competition between the recreational side and the medical side. So I guess I'll throw it out to you. What does your plan look like, and how do you address these types of issues?
Well, first you have to understand, and the reason why, look, I'm the only person in the Democratic race with the vision, experience, and record that people are looking for. The democratic values, democratic principles, and experience actually doing them in federal. I mean, more than half the people I'm running against have never run for dog catcher. I mean, and so having the ability to work with the legislature, I think, is critical, and getting the bill passed in the best form. I see it as a false choice. I think that the medical industry and the recreational industry can work together. I've actually represented minority-owned businesses and others in the cannabis space in my private sector as a lawyer, which I do now, and sort of seen some of those issues. Now, the good side of us being behind legalization of recreational use of marijuana is that other states have had it. You remember in the medical space, Colorado, I think, was the first or second to do it. And something like 85% of people that had prescriptions for arthritis to get the medical marijuana were under 26 years old. So the system was abused. Right. And there's been protections put in over time in Maryland, and that would have to, and now that we've seen sort of what works and what doesn't around the country, I think you want to bring the best and the brightest to bear there. And so the idea is to make sure there's equity in the small businesses that we're going to have providing that. We need to make sure there's regulation, that we're not over-regulating, but making sure it's safe, and that we get the tax money, and we can use it for, to put in the blueprint going forward for education and pre-K and universal child care and some of the other issues that I want to do. So I don't have the full answer to exactly what it's going to look like, other than take the best components of how it's been implemented in other states and do that in Maryland.
Okay. All right. We've got a lot to go through. We're going to get to education in a second. I didn't want to leave public safety completely. An issue that is not talked about enough in public safety is juvenile justice, because that's the precursor, obviously, to individuals committing actual crimes. Any thoughts about what a Gansler administration would look like in terms of that issue? Where are we falling down? Because the recidivism rate is stubbornly high with kids that go into the system, and they end up turning into better criminals. And so I guess you've dealt with this as state's attorney and through your career. Any thoughts about what we should be doing differently?
Juvenile justice, as you know, is the most difficult area of criminal law, really, because by definition, you're dealing with juveniles. And we've been talking a little bit lately about the Beltway snipers. One of my cases that I prosecuted, where John Muhammad actually was executed in Virginia, but Malvo was a juvenile at the time. Now, the problem with a guy like Malvo, who was a serial killer that killed 22 people across the country, is that he was a juvenile. So as they say, bad cases make bad law. Everyone's like, oh well, look at that guy. But most juvenile offenders are minor offenders. They're just starting on the path toward bigger crimes. The issues are complicated because they come, they come from broken homes. They come from places where they don't have food. They come from schools in Baltimore City where, a low percentage of children that actually live long enough to graduate from high school and can graduate from high school, a high percentage of them can't read at an 8th grade level, and you're trying to figure out why they're getting in trouble. So it's complicated. I don't think more enforcement is the answer for juveniles. I think more social services and being available to juvenile offenders is critical. Part of education is that there are ramifications and consequences for your acts. So we started teen court in Montgomery County, where we actually had teens adjudicate smaller level cases of other juveniles, and they actually ended up being more harsh in their penalties than the judges would in most cases. But if having that door clank behind you is often a wake-up call, even if it's a night, one night or whatever. So I think we really need to look at juvenile justice reform in a serious way, but recognizing the complexity of it going forward.
So how about, you brought up the Malvo case. One of the proposals, or actually one of the issues I think that's already been passed is, and continuing conversation nationally is, should juveniles be able to get life without parole, or should they, are kids just kids, as some legislators would have you believe? You have a kid who shoots 22 people, and they end up back out on the street when they're 30 or 40 years old. Is that an appropriate response, or what are your thoughts? I mean, I know that there's a constitutional issue with mandatory life without parole for juveniles. That's unconstitutional, but the possibility of it is not. Where do you fall on that?
No, it's
a tough issue.
And Malvo is interesting. So, you'll recall I led the Joint Sniper Task Force at that time for those 22 days in 2002, and they went to Virginia because John Ashcroft at the time wanted to get the death penalty for the juveniles. They lost that case. Ultimately came back. We prosecuted the case, and as the judge said, it was the perfect trial, and it worked out really well. But it was the most interesting thing when you talk about Malvo is he wrote me a letter from jail, and he wanted to meet with me to talk about that. At this time, he was sort of no longer associated mentally with Muhammad, and so we brought him into the office. And when I say the office, I mean my office, my state's attorney's office, heavily armed. And what do you say to a serial killer? So I said, how are you spending your time in jail? And he said, well, I read a lot. I said, what are you reading? And he said, The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And we got into this 15-minute conversation about Peter Keating and Howard Roark and the difference of the two characters. And I'm like, this is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the 22 families that lost loved ones and the people that died, as well as the communities that were just scared because of these guys and what they did to all of us, the terrorism they wreaked upon Maryland and other states. On the other hand, you're taking a 17-year-old and putting him in a cage for the next 40, 50, 60 years. Again, bad cases make bad law, so taking him away for a second because of the egregious nature of the crime, there are a lot of 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds that commit crimes. We were all different when we were 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. So I am constitutional, the constitutional decisions that were made by the Supreme Court aside, I don't think juveniles should ever have been executed. I don't think juveniles should ever get life without the possibility of parole. Okay. I think everybody should be given a second chance and can be rehabilitated. It's difficult to imagine, again, taking Malvo out of many cases. There are some, of many cases where somebody who committed a crime when they're a juvenile, after spending 20 or 25 years, I mean, most people wouldn't want to spend 25 minutes, let alone 25 days in jail. And we just throw these numbers out like they're, because most people haven't been part of the criminal justice system. But someone spent 25 years in jail for a crime they committed when they're 16, 17, 18 years old, ought to be able to come before a parole board and make their cases to how they can be productive members of society. Just because you're parole eligible doesn't mean you get parole.
Did you agree with what they just did, I think yesterday, which is to take the governor out of the parole process?
I mean, sort of. Like, I don't think law should be personalized. Like one of my competitors, they stripped all his powers as comptroller because they didn't like him. That's a problem in the sense that that the job, someone's got to be regulating alcohol and tobacco, and so looking at who the governor happens to be, we have a long line of Republican governors, and if I don't win the primary, we're going to have another one. So do you say, well, we're going to have a Republican governor, therefore we should take them out of the process? I find that a little troubling. It doesn't matter to me one way or the other, because as governor, I'm very sympathetic and understanding about what the system ought to look like, and I don't think people should spend, if someone should be given parole, they should be given parole, and I'm not going to stand in the way of that anyway, because the professionals have looked at it. I do think we incarcerate too many people, and I do think there's a lot of old people in jail that were there when they were young, and we're paying for their health care, and we're paying to lock them up and their security for no particular reason when they're not a danger whatsoever to themselves or the community. And we ought to be a little bit more flexible in looking at seniors when they're locked up for crimes they committed when they were juveniles.
Okay. We have a little less than 10 minutes left, and I've got some rapid round questions I want to ask you. Some yes, no, with maybe a little explanation. All right, the first one is, and I've asked all the candidates this because it's an interesting issue, there are some legal ramifications, but at its core, it's an economic issue, and this has to do with this so-called BDS movement, right? And the governor, based on a bill by Senator Kramer and others, put an executive order in that said that companies that are involved in this boycotting of one of our sister states, Israel, cannot do business with the state of Maryland. They can't participate in our 401k or our pension plan, can't get state contracts. As governor, will you keep that executive order in place?
Absolutely, and we'll go a little further. When I was Attorney General, I worked with the Attorney General of Georgia, who was a Republican, Sam Olens, and we asked to have Maryland divest in companies that were dealing with Iran at the time because of their issues. And I led a delegation to Israel of Attorneys General and talked about that we wrote a letter and we talked about that very issue when we were there. I worked with Israel on the Scheinbein case when a young man murdered Alfredo Teo in Montgomery County and then fled to Israel in terms of getting him back. I spent a lot of time in Israel. I went there in high school. My son played for Team Israel lacrosse. And it's not only a wonderful country, but the government budget, the Maryland budget, is a moral document. And how we use that is critical. And we should not be supporting companies that boycott Israel. So yes.
Okay. Judicial elections we've gone through. There was an interesting conversation in one of the other interviews about school resource officer programs. And I set it up, and I feel like I may slant the question, but I'm not trying to. In Baltimore County, there's a proposal by a delegate, I believe, from Howard County to ban the SRO program. In Baltimore County, we have what is widely considered the national model for school resource officer programs, and the National School Resource Officer of the Year is actually a Baltimore County SRO. It seems to me a program that fits in the mold of community policing, but there's at least some faction of individuals based on whatever that want to get rid of that program. As governor, would you support the SRO program for places like Baltimore County, or do you believe that they should get rid of that program?
I don't believe they should get rid of the program at all. I think that it's actually a very useful program. It is part of community policing. In fact, those who are worried about disproportionate arrests of juveniles should look at the statistics and facts to show that schools that have SROs actually have a reduced number, because the police officers work with the kids there and say, hey, that you shouldn't be doing that, and they have conversations. I also, as part of my mental health platform that I just put out this past week, that's also available at douggansler.com, we're talking about having mental health officers in all the schools. So any school, for every 250 kids, there ought to be a mental health officer, somebody that can talk to because of mental health issues. We talked about Grace's Law before and the bullying online and some of these issues that you ought to have a mental health professional. But you also ought to have, if communities want to have SROs, if counties like Baltimore County want to have SROs, they ought to be able to have them. We haven't had it too often in Maryland, but you have school shootings, that kind of thing. You want someone there, and a police officer already there. So I don't really understand the argument against it. So I certainly would, unless somebody can convince me that it's a bad thing for minorities, communities of color, or children to have, I'm dating myself, but officer friendly in the school, I'm okay with it.
Okay. Couple other things real fast before I let you do a wrap up. There's a new bill new idea that just came out. I'm not quite sure the details of it, but essentially it's to put into our Constitution a constitutional amendment for a clean environment. And I guess the question, I assume that would allow you to sue under the Constitution for things like, spills or what have you, as a private citizen. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? I think it's based on the Pennsylvania constitutional amendment.
So I pushed, when I was Attorney General, I pushed a bill with Aaron Fitzsimmons, which was my Special Assistant for the Environment, and through the Environmental Council that we set up, we passed a bill that gave standing to environmental agencies to sue the government and to sue for environmental infractions. So I'm okay. I like the idea of standing for people to be able to sue. I think we're very restrictive on standing vis-a-vis the environment. That said, making some unenforceable constitutional amendment around it seems to me a little bit of a stretch. I'd rather elect a governor that's an environmentalist and work from the top down.
Okay. And again, we are rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes, which I know is not enough, to talk about education, because I know you had mentioned that before. In 2 minutes before your wrap up, what does a Gansler education program look like? Was the blueprint on the right track? And if so, what else beyond that should we be doing?
Yeah, and I guess I could almost do this a yes/no as well, because who the next governor is going to be absolutely critical to the blueprint and the Kerwin Commission. And if you look at the Gansler poll, which said a moderate Republican beats a progressive Democrat in Maryland next year by almost 20%, because it's going to be such a Republican year, that if I don't win the primary, and therefore I'm not that we don't have a Democrat as governor, the blueprint's going in the trash. I mean, we're going to have a Republican governor. They're certainly not going to pass it. They're going to be against it. And so the amount of effort that Britt Kerwin put in and the commission put in to get the blueprint passed and to get it there and to have the adequate funding will be of no moment. So I think that's number one. Number two, some of the elements of the blueprint are essential. For example, pre-K, universal pre-K. We see that by the time the kids from underserved communities show up at kindergarten, the divide is already so great that they never catch up. And we need to pay our teachers more. We have to respect and pay our teachers. They're who we give our children to. We ought to have every kid has to be able to read at a 8th grade level by 8th grade. and not when they're graduating from high school. So we need to focus on education, educational reform, but we need to have a Democrat as governor.
Okay. So now we have come to the end. I want to first of all say thank you so much for being here with me for this hour at FLU. Talked about a lot of interesting legal issues, and I want to give you the last chance to just kind of one more time tell us, come the primary election in June and beyond that, why should the members of the bar and those who are watching this and beyond that, their families and everybody else in Maryland, elect Doug Gansler as the next governor of the state of Maryland?
Well, thank you, Bobby. Thanks again for the opportunity. I mean, I think members of the bar. I'm the only practicing member of the bar that's running for governor. So I know the folks at the bar. I'm at the Baltimore County dinner every year. When I spoke at it, I did not get rolls thrown at me. I don't think. I think I got up and off.
I'm sure that's not true.
Yeah, no, I think I knew about it, and so I kind of got up on stage and got off quickly enough that I didn't get them thrown at me. But but I know what that is all about. And so I've spoken to state bar, county bar associations through my for decades, and I understand the travails and challenges of being a lawyer in Maryland. So I think, and I understand the laws. I was the chief law enforcement officer. I was the chief legal officer of the state of Maryland, and so I think that's an advantage for members of the bar to have as their governor. I also will repeat, but I do believe that I'm the only person running for governor with democratic values, experience, and a record of accomplishment that will provide me the opportunity on day one to be an effective governor. This is no time to experiment coming out of a crisis, which is COVID. Nobody wants, as somebody said to me the other day, I at least want my NFL quarterbacks to have played high school ball. And you don't want to hire a lawyer that didn't go to law school. You don't want to hire a doctor that didn't go to medical school. And many of the people I'm running against, while wonderful people, they're great at their raising money for their nonprofits or whatever they've done, and have accomplishments. You got to have the experience is required to know how to work the levers of government to get things done to be able to be a governor. So I think it's an important election. Politicians always say this is the most important election of your lives. It's not, but I do think for things like women's reproductive rights, criminal justice, for the environment, for rebuilding the economy after COVID, you need somebody with experience, and I have that experience.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end. I again want to say thank you so much for spending the hour with us. And
thank you.
On behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association and Stevenson University, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. It was an honor to have you this morning.
You wear this moderator role well. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.